There is a piece of old wisdom worth starting with. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Most people have heard it, though not everyone is entirely sure what it actually means. So let's unpack it, because it happens to explain a great deal about how narcissistic relationships actually work. This saying is about getting so wrapped up in the individual pieces of something, the trees, that you lose sight of the whole picture, the forest. It is wisdom that applies across many areas of life. You get so absorbed in the details of planning an event that you forget the actual purpose of the event. You get so buried in researching a paper that you lose track of what the paper was even supposed to argue. You plan every single detail of a vacation and forget that the entire point was simply to get away, breathe, and gain a different perspective. This particular proverb traces back to the 16th century, credited to a writer named John Haywood. But the point here is not the history lesson. The point is connecting this old idea to how people get pulled into narcissistic relationships. In the early stages, people tend to get completely absorbed in the trees. This matters most in relationships formed in adulthood, romantic partnerships, workplace connections, friendships. When meeting someone new, attention naturally gravitates toward the surface level details, appearance, career, accomplishments, interests, rather than the whole person underneath. That tree-focused instinct works heavily in favor of narcissistic individuals because they are remarkably skilled at growing impressive trees. Research consistently shows that narcissistic people invest more in their appearance, dress more sharply, present a more curated and interesting version of their life than most people bother to. All of that is simply trees. Those trees also feed directly into cognitive dissonance. The moment something uncomfortable surfaces, rudeness, arrogance, sudden anger, manipulation, disrespect, it gets talked away. Because the impressive, interesting, successful trees are right there, providing a convenient counter-argument. Worse, people often turn the blame inward, wondering if they are simply asking for too much. Everything gets messy fast when the trees are the only thing in view. Learning to see the forest instead of only the trees is, in a real sense, the work of moving through that cognitive dissonance. The ability to hold the full integrated picture of a person instead of getting distracted by the shiny individual pieces. Narcissistic people depend on you never getting there. Their entire strategy relies on being impressive, clever, charming, or at least convincing enough that you never look past the trees. Seeing the forest requires facing uncomfortable facts and uncomfortable truths. It means integrating the pieces that do not fit comfortably together and reckoning honestly with what they add up to. A toxic relationship with a handful of pleasant elements scattered throughout it. Staying tree-focused is, in many ways, a way of avoiding that reckoning altogether, jumping from one pleasant tree to the next without ever confronting how treacherous the surrounding forest actually is. Seeing the forest for the trees is honestly a mark of wisdom, the ability to integrate information and recognize the larger pattern underneath it. This shows up everywhere, even in something as simple as academic performance. The students who consistently perform the strongest are rarely the ones who just memorize isolated facts. They are the ones who see how everything connects. Applying that same skill to personal relationships is far harder. Seeing the forest does not automatically mean dismantling a relationship either. In a genuinely healthy relationship, seeing the whole forest is often exactly what keeps things intact. Someone kind, considerate, and respectful might not have flashy credentials. They might struggle financially despite working hard, or they might be going through a rough patch, yet remain patient and steady underneath it. Fixating only on the superficial trees in that case would mean missing the deeper virtues actually holding the relationship together. This idea genuinely runs in both directions. But when it comes to narcissistic relationships specifically, the narcissist benefits enormously from you staying locked onto the trees and never stepping back far enough to see the forest, because the moment you do, you notice that while a few genuinely nice trees exist scattered throughout, the forest itself is bleak and dangerous. It is tempting to take the easier path and avoid looking at the forest altogether. But as this proverb reminds us, that is never actually the wiser move. When individual trees start coalescing into a recognizable forest, pay attention. And if you find yourself in a narcissistic relationship, pull your focus away from the trees for a moment. Take in the whole forest and decide honestly whether that is a forest worth staying in. Next, a bad worker always blames their tools. This one traces back to 13th century France. Translated roughly as a poor tradesperson can never seem to find the right tool. The surface meaning is straightforward. Someone unskilled and often lacking the self-awareness to recognize it blames a missing tool rather than their own inability or lack of effort. It is part victimhood, part blame, tangled together. Elevated beyond literal tools, this proverb captures something central to narcissism: the deep difficulty narcissistic individuals have taking any responsibility at all. Just as the bad worker blames shoddy tools for shoddy work, a narcissistic person tends to blame everyone around them for their own mistakes, failures, disappointments, and frustrations. This makes these relationships genuinely exhausting because you are constantly on the receiving end of blame that was never yours to carry. In the early stages of knowing someone narcissistic, you may find yourself repeatedly trying to correct the record, insisting you did not do the thing you are being blamed for, that it is not your fault, that you really were not responsible. That correction rarely lands because reality itself does not really matter to this personality pattern in those moments. What matters is deflecting blame outward in order to preserve a grandiose, flawless self-image. The failed presentation was the client's fault for rescheduling. It was the assistant's fault for disorganized materials. It was a partner's fault for not keeping the house quiet enough. Everything traces back to someone else. For most people who live through relationships like this, that blame deflection becomes one of the most exhausting, destabilizing, and confusing parts of the entire dynamic. Blame gets offloaded so consistently that the other person in the relationship ends up absorbing responsibility for things they never actually caused, which over time breeds guilt and self-blame that has no real basis. Spend long enough around someone like this, and eventually you stop waiting for them to assign the blame at all. You start doing it to yourself preemptively, cutting out the manipulative middle step entirely. People caught in these dynamics often try to compensate by hyper-controlling their environment, keeping everything meticulously organized in an almost obsessive effort to minimize any possible trigger for another blame-shifting episode. It rarely works. Even a perfectly organized home does not stop the accusation that the scissors were somehow hidden from them. Protecting yourself from this pattern requires a real foundation of self-assurance, a clear internal sense of what actually is and is not your responsibility, along with an honest acknowledgement that some situations genuinely involve shared responsibility. Underneath all of this sits an unconscious, fairly primitive process, projecting uncomfortable and shameful internal deficits outward onto other people rather than sitting with them. The disconnection from empathy that so often accompanies narcissism makes that projection easier, because there is little pause to consider how unfair the blame actually feels to the person receiving it. This blame shifting frequently gets paired with a sense of victimhood too. I could not find the right tool because nobody supports me. The presentation failed because people are out to get me and nobody believes in me. That self-victimization is a defining piece of the pattern. Whoever first wrote this proverb, watching people botch a job and blame their tools, captured something that has apparently existed in human behavior for centuries. When you find yourself facing this kind of blame shifting, the wisest move is usually minimal engagement, a calm nod, a brief acknowledgement, documentation where it genuinely matters, and the quiet recognition that your version of events is unlikely to actually be heard. It is unjust. It genuinely is. But recognizing the injustice does not require endlessly fighting to be believed by someone who is never going to listen in the first place. Then there is the road to hell is paved with good intentions, most reliably traced to a French abbot named Bernard of Clairvaux around the 1100s. The surface meaning is clear enough. Good intentions do not guarantee a good outcome and sometimes lead somewhere bleak instead. Applied to narcissism, this proverb runs in two directions at once, like a two-lane highway. On one side sits the survivor of the relationship, not the narcissistic person. These are the people who keep trying again and again to hold the attention of someone clearly disengaged, believing on some level that they themselves are responsible for the dissatisfaction in the relationship rather than recognizing it belongs to the other person. So they try harder, maybe more calls, more gratitude, more praise, a cleaner house, more effort to showcase their own accomplishments, anything that might finally keep the relationship steady. Those instincts come from a genuinely good place, wanting to be a good partner, friend, or family member. But no matter the effort, the manipulation, invalidation, and unsettling emotional swings continue, and trying harder simply leads deeper into a kind of personal hell, sometimes echoing patterns first learned in childhood, where trying harder never seemed to be enough either. One story that captures this involves someone who spent years trying to satisfy a narcissistic family member around a birthday, starting with a card, then a gift, then 2 gifts, then flowers, and more, hoping each year might finally be the one that landed right. Each year brought more criticism instead, until the anticipation of the date itself began triggering physical symptoms of stress. That is the road to hell in action. Genuine effort met with escalating dissatisfaction, no matter how much is given. The other side of that highway belongs to the narcissistic person themselves. Their gestures can look like good intentions on the surface, an expensive gift you never asked for, while a genuinely useful simple request goes ignored because it felt boring or beneath them. These gestures often trace back to self-interest, feeding the narcissist's own ego more than actually serving the other person's real needs. And they frequently arrive tangled up with other toxic behaviors, invalidation, sudden rage, dismissiveness. Rage in the morning, followed by flowers in the evening, dismissing someone's feelings, followed by an elaborate vacation. Many people caught in these relationships say they would happily give up every gift and gesture in exchange for simple, consistent kindness. But that is the exact trap of good intentions. Coming from someone fundamentally self-focused, gifts often function to prop up the giver's own image, and any lack of sufficient gratitude in response can trigger real anger, as though there were an invisible bar of appropriate appreciation that must be cleared. This confusing mix of generosity and cruelty can leave people feeling guilty for having any negative feelings at all about someone who, on paper, does nice things for them. A parent who provides financially while continuing to scapegoat. A boss who pays generously while bullying constantly. This confusion is genuinely destabilizing, and those apparent good intentions are often exactly what keeps someone stuck on that particular road. In the long run, these relationships remain difficult and often unhealthy, regardless of how many good intentions appear to be paving the way. Whatever the underlying gesture, gift, advice, or otherwise, be cautious about where that particular road actually leads. Finally, do not insult a crocodile while your feet are still in the water. This African proverb is a personal favorite, and its meaning is plain enough. Do not provoke something dangerous while you remain close enough to be harmed by it. It applies directly to narcissistic relationships, and it is really a more vivid version of a simple piece of advice. Do not call them out, especially while you remain in close proximity or ongoing relationship with them. When people first enter relationships with narcissistic or otherwise high-conflict individuals, they usually assume they are dealing with someone who behaves in a generally healthy way. Warning signs appear and get dismissed, until eventually the original assumption turns out to be wrong, though it is not always clear what to do about it at that point. For a while, people try the things that work in healthy relationships: open communication, honest feedback, calling out behavior that feels wrong. None of it works the way it should. A common technique, sharing feelings using calm, first-person statements, tends to be met with indifference, distracted confusion, or outright rage, because naming feelings directly activates a narcissistic person's discomfort around emotion itself, or triggers contempt at someone else's needs being voiced at all. What never actually shows up in response is empathy, ownership, or genuine accountability. Attempts to simply connect on a human level fare no better. There is a specific pattern worth naming here, an inevitability paradox. Conversations with a narcissistic person will eventually go wrong if they continue long enough, no matter how carefully they are handled, because the underlying insecurity runs so deep that something eventually, unintentionally, will strike a nerve. A conversation that felt warm and easy can flip suddenly into rage, sulking, or passive aggression, often leaving the other person confused about what actually happened. Being in a relationship with a narcissistic person means, in effect, permanently dangling your feet in water that has crocodiles in it. It does not need to register as an actual insult, only as something the narcissistic person perceives as one. Avoiding that inevitable turn generally means keeping interactions brief before the conversation has room to slide over the edge. But the worst possible move is directly poking the crocodile, naming their shortcomings outright, or making pointed accusations, however accurate. That is essentially climbing directly into the crocodile's open mouth. Calling someone like this out simply does not work, no matter how satisfying it might feel in the moment to finally be heard after years of holding it in. It is a bit like extending an arm toward a wild animal at a sanctuary hoping to pet it, when everyone already knows exactly what is going to happen next. Many people who eventually get out of a narcissistic relationship entirely, once the papers are signed, once there is real physical and emotional distance, choose to finally say what they have been holding back, not because they expected to change anything, but simply to put the truth into words once. Some describe being met with a level of cruelty and precision so devastating it left them physically shaken afterward, regretting ever having said anything at all. Others say they do not regret it. They simply waited until their feet were finally out of the water first. A mistake that shows up again and again in families, romantic relationships, workplaces, even formal mediation settings, is continuing to try to genuinely engage a narcissistic person as though real resolution were possible. Occasionally, under very rare circumstances, something resembling capitulation happens, usually to avoid a harsher consequence rather than from any real internal shift. This can sound pessimistic, and it draws real criticism, but the pattern holds up again and again in practice. These personality patterns tend to be rigid, poorly regulated, lacking real insight, punitive, and largely dismissive of anyone else's inner experience. Proverbs like these carry a kind of old, distilled wisdom about human nature that still holds up remarkably well today. The advice ultimately is simple: get your feet out of the water. Once you are safely out of reach, and only then, say whatever you genuinely need to say, understanding that the crocodile, or the narcissist, was likely never truly listening in the first place, and that the real goal was never getting them to hear you, it was getting yourself safely to shore. Taken together, these 4 pieces of old wisdom really point at the same underlying skill: the ability to see clearly instead of reactively. Seeing the forest instead of just the trees means resisting the pull of surface charm long enough to notice the whole pattern underneath it. Recognizing the bad worker blaming their tools means catching blame shifting for what it is instead of quietly absorbing responsibility that was never yours. Understanding the road to hell paved with good intentions means learning to separate genuine effort from performance and noticing when your own good intentions are being used against you. And respecting the crocodile in the water means knowing the difference between speaking your truth and speaking it safely at a moment when it can no longer be used to hurt you. None of this wisdom asks you to stop caring, stop hoping, or stop trying to understand the people in your life. It simply asks you to pair that caring with clear eyes. Wisdom in this sense is not cynicism. It is not deciding that people are bad or unworthy of compassion. It is the discipline of looking at a full pattern of behavior over time, rather than getting swept up in any single flattering or disarming moment. A narcissistic person can be genuinely charming in one conversation and genuinely cruel in the next. And both of those things can be true at once without canceling each other out. Wisdom is what lets you hold both truths steady instead of talking yourself out of the second one because the first one felt so convincing. It is also worth saying plainly, that none of this is about becoming someone who no longer trusts anyone or who treats every relationship like a courtroom, gathering evidence and waiting for betrayal. That kind of hypervigilance is its own kind of exhausting, and it is not what these proverbs are actually pointing toward. The goal is closer to a kind of calm discernment, paying attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents, noticing when the trees keep being offered up in place of the forest, noticing when the tools keep getting blamed instead of the choices, noticing when generosity always seems to arrive bundled with cruelty. That kind of attention protects you without requiring you to become suspicious of everyone. If any of this sounds familiar, if you have spent time trying harder, explaining more clearly, organizing everything more carefully, or waiting for the right moment to finally say what you actually think, you are not alone in that. And you were not foolish for trying. Most people extend good faith by default because most relationships actually deserve it. The lesson here is not that you did something wrong by trying. It is that certain patterns do not respond to good faith the way healthy relationships do. And recognizing that early can save years of energy that would otherwise be spent chasing an outcome that was never actually available. Old wisdom survives for a reason. Sometimes the clearest path forward really is the simplest one. See the whole forest. Notice who keeps blaming their tools. Watch where the good intentions actually lead, and know exactly when your feet are still in the water.